The West feared the enormous potential power of a Sino-Soviet Communist bloc. But within a couple of years of Khrushchev's departure, Mao's China had fallen out with Moscow over major ideological differences.
China will pursue its own independent foreign policy.
Will there be a return to the time in the 1950s when the Kremlin was very much big brother over Peking?
Ideologically, we have some similarity because of Marxist-Leninism route, but I think we have different ways to go.
How do the Chinese treat you here? Are you a friend of theirs, or do they still see you as a bit of an enemy?
No, I never saw any marks that I was an enemy.
A factory in Harbin, close to China's border with the Soviet Union. A security guard descends into the system of defense tunnels built in the early 70s to protect Harbin's 2.5 million inhabitants against Soviet attack. On the wall, Chairman Mao's words of 17 years ago still warn of the dangers of nuclear war. In the connecting passages, workers who might seek refuge are told, "Don't be afraid of death." Today, the underground shelters built to protect thousands against Soviet bombs have been converted to factory workshops. This Soviet-style city no longer considers itself vulnerable to Soviet attack. There is a new Sino-Soviet détente, a rapid easing of tension. China's military strategists, who spent 2 decades preparing for war with the Kremlin, have a new assessment of whether the Soviet Union of President Gorbachev remains capable of attacking China and whether it has a will to do so.
I don't think it's possible for the Soviet Union to organize any aggressive actions on China at this moment. That is to say, the Soviet Union has the capacity, but not the will at the moment.
Both sides now have understood that it's a stupidity, it's nonsense to station so many, military personnel, troops there. It's nothing. We cannot tie them down here, and they cannot invade China.
Since 1917, relations between China and the Soviet Union have been through several periods of great warmth and great turbulence. This memorial commemorates the Soviet garrison which occupied Harbin for much of the Second World War and a year after. The people of Harbin have bitter memories of Soviet behavior. Now, Soviets are being welcomed back to Harbin again, the first time since the very close ties between Peking and Moscow in the 1950s. This is a trade delegation from Siberia in high spirits, but they revealed to us nothing of what they had come to negotiate.
I don't speak English. I speak China.
The basis of the new Sino-Soviet relations will not just be improved trade and economic relations. Young Chinese in the north have been brought up with military values, conditioned to see the Soviet Union in potentially apocalyptic terms. Until very recently, almost all political and economic links had been severed. Diplomatic relations were in a chill. Now the Sino-Soviet language has changed. The Cold War is past, the atmosphere noticeably relaxed. Chinese analysts of the Soviet Union, like Professor Zhu, predict a new relationship based on peaceful coexistence, independence, equality, and respect for sovereignty. Full normalization, though, will take time.
One cannot say that all obstacles have been completely removed. So after the normalization of the relations between two countries, it is still necessary to continue the effort to make the obstacles totally removed.
One outstanding obstacle is the line of the 5,000-mile Sino-Soviet border. For many years, the Kremlin insisted control of this, the vast Ussuri River, was Soviet by right. Now Mr. Gorbachev agrees the border should run down the middle. Soviet and Chinese merchant ships ply freely the waters once controlled by Soviet warships. The border dispute, which almost took Moscow and Beijing to war in the 60s, will finally be settled by negotiation. Suddenly, Chinese, who've long been conditioned to ignore and mistrust anything Soviet like the Soviet embassy in Beijing, are being asked to change their views. For 2 decades, Soviet diplomats and officials have effectively been bunkered behind the embassy gates, isolated and cold-shouldered by the Chinese. But the Kremlin has now withdrawn its troops from Afghanistan, is withdrawing others from Mongolia, and has forced Vietnam to withdraw its troops from Cambodia by next October. China sees Moscow as having made all the concessions, although there remain doubts about Mr. Gorbachev's long-term intentions.
I am not sure if his global, international strategy has changed, or internationally his initiatives are just a tactical, maneuver. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the Soviet Union in next century will come back again into the Afghanistan or not. But I'm sure that his domestic reform, economic as well as political, is sincere.
It's exactly 30 years since Mr. Khrushchev travelled to Beijing for the last Sino-Soviet Summit with Mao Zedong. The scale of the reception for Khrushchev underlined the closeness of the Soviet and Chinese Communist parties in the 1950s. It was a decade in which Big Brother helped China's new revolutionaries cast the political and economic mold for a communist system identical to that in the Soviet Union. The West feared the enormous potential power of a Sino-Soviet communist bloc. But within a couple of years of Khrushchev's departure, Mao's China had fallen out with Moscow over major ideological differences. The Sino-Soviet frost had begun. Today, the question is whether the new Dong-Gorbachev summit signals a return to the powerful Sino-Soviet strategic axis created by Mao and Khrushchev, which so alarmed the West in the 50s.
China has declared very clearly it will not establish any strategic relations with any superpower, with any political bloc in the world. So China will pursue its own independent foreign policy.
Will there be a return to the time in the 1950s when the Kremlin was very much Big Brother over Peking?
I think the history will never repeat. This is such a state of the party-to-party relations.
United States officials in particular have expressed fears that a new Sino-Soviet communist bloc might emerge after next week's summit. But sources say that China's paramount leader Deng Xiaoping assured President Bush here in February that future relations with Moscow will be on a state-to-state basis only. Chinese analysts say the resumption of party-to-party relations after a break of 25 years will not signal a new communist alliance.
No. Just simply no. No strategic alliance. And ideologically, we have some similarity because of Marxist-Leninism route. But I think we have different ways to go ahead to improve our system, to improve our economy, to improve our culture, and so on and so forth.
After a quarter of a century of diplomatic frost, on the streets here, the Gorbachev visit is seen as signaling a new Sino-Soviet understanding to live and let live. At the most personal, human level, the effects can be seen already.
You know, I studied Russian before, and I have a desire to visit Russian, but I have had no chance so far.
Do you think you will after the relations are normalized?
Of course, it's possible.
Misha is one of just a dozen Soviet students studying at Beijing University.
This visit, we hope, will help for us, for students, for example, will help for our people in the normal relations. The trade relations, the economic, the financial relations, and others.
How do the Chinese treat you here? Are you a friend of theirs, or do they still see you as a bit of an enemy?
No, I never saw any marks that I was an enemy.
Beijing's great hope is that removing the Soviet military threat will help China divert its resources from swords to plowshares, to help the millions of desperately backward Chinese like these peasant farmers who live near the Soviet border. Peace on this northern border will help, but way to the south there remains military tension from a different quarter. 2,500 miles south of the Soviet border is the South China Sea, across which China remains locked in a dangerous state of military tension with the Soviet-backed government of Vietnam. China and Vietnam dispute control of scores of islands here. At stake is access to substantial undersea oil reserves. A drive along this beautiful, unspoilt coast gives an idea of China's defense against Vietnam. The barrels of anti-aircraft batteries guard the main towns and ports. A significant proportion of China's navy is committed to the South China Sea. It's estimated 300,000 military personnel remain on a state of high alert to counter what Beijing views as the continuing military threat from Vietnam.
In the past 2 years, the Vietnamese government has strengthened its war preparations in that region, and last year it has provoked an armed conflict with our research and exploratory ships in that area. But so far, there's not enough evidence which can prove Vietnam has abandoned its hegemonist policy and its hegemonist ambition of expansion.
The prospect of economic riches at sea seemed to be forcing both China and Vietnam to inch forward and bring peace to the last remaining area of tension in Asia. In Beijing, the Vietnamese embassy has brokered the first visits to China by senior Hanoi officials in a decade.
The Sino-Soviet Summit meeting and the normalization of the relations between China and Soviet Union is not only beneficial to the peoples of these two countries, but also beneficial to the peace and stability of Asia and the peace and stability of the world.
Across what have been the zones of tension in Asia, the mood is changing from conflict to coexistence as Mr. Gorbachev prepares to travel to Beijing. Nick Gowing, ITN, in China.